also there, but it was a very, very inspiring event, so I'm very happy to be here, although it's somewhat terrifying being on the other side of the stage, but climate change is quite terrifying, and I think sometimes you just got to face your fears, so let's go. So why do we need maybe doesn't even need to be answered, but we're going to take a look anyway. And what can we do to get there? Who is we? And what role can technology play in accelerating climate action, both on a physical and on a human scale? I'm going to let Yassine kick off that first question. God, the screen is so big. He's one of the many people in the world who are actually feeling the impact of climate change, something that we here in Europe still aren't. Yasin is the director of the Friends of the Sambara Society. It is an organisation in Tanzania. Originally, the organisation used to run eco-tours in the Usambara region of Tanzania. But now they do major landscape restoration of their area. And in the last 2 years, they've planted 3 million trees, almost out of nothing. They basically look around them, saw what was happening to their natural environment, and they decided to take action. Yes, we can. Is this not working? Yeah, and so what's amazing about the project that Yassine works on is that the whole community is involved, all the villagers are involved, even the schools, the children now learn about the importance of trees and how to look after them, and they even take back saplings to their homes and their families, and all the villagers nearby are involved in the process. And I think I just wanted to start with some words from Yassine, because I think it kind of explains quite well what we're dealing with here. He's talking about why this work is important for them.
If the disaster is appearing and then we don't take anything on it, we don't take anything to preserve, what are we going to tell our children? What are we going to tell our grandchildren when they're asking us, what's happening? What have you done if this disaster is happening? When it's happening, as a parent, what did you do? So my dream is to see people planting a lot of trees. So we thank even Ecosia very much for coming up to join this effort. Imagine, we are over 6 billion on the earth. If every day one person plant trees for a year, you can imagine how many trees will be planted. We could save the planet, and we could make the Usambara and the planet the best place to live.
Yeah. Specifically the Usambara, the best place to be. The world is getting hotter, and it is being caused by us. That's generally not disputed anymore, apart from by some people. We'll get onto that. Climate change is the greatest challenge that humans have ever faced. As Yassine put it, disaster is coming. A significantly warmer world will have consequences on food production, water security, the spread of disease, migration, infrastructure. Indeed, as we speak, grade 5 hurricanes of unprecedented intensity are sweeping across the Caribbean islands, causing, as of yet unknown, loss of human life and devastation. Extreme weather events like this are going to be more frequent, and they're likely to get worse. So any conversation that we have around how we can create a better world for the future, be that economically or socially, it really needs to be placed in the context of climate change. And yet, talking about climate change has struggled to evoke emotion in the same way, quite in the same way as other issues do. Perhaps the consequences are too long-term, too far away for us to associate with, and then that we can't really think so well ahead. Maybe, as one journalist has suggested, that the term climate change is too bland, and it doesn't really encapsulate the urgency of the situation. I think he proposed climate degradation or something like this. Whatever the reason is, the fact is that the response hasn't really matched the magnitude of the problem at hand. Certainly no leader has called for a war on global warming, or something which might in scale and further at least match Nixon's war on drugs or Bush's war on terror, even though the scale of the threat of climate change far exceeds anything else we've had. Indeed, it threatens our very way of life as we know it. But climate change has never received the so-called crisis treatment from governments and leaders. And international commitments still lack a sense of urgency. God, that is terrifying. Let's talk about the Paris Climate Agreement. It is without doubt the greatest achievement to date in climate diplomacy. That shouldn't be overlooked. And yet, President Trump did decide to withdraw America from it. America being the planet's second largest emitter of CO2. Brexit, on the other hand, has called into question the EU's ability to hold a unified stance against climate change. Right now, Poland is acting against an EU order to cease logging of the Białowieża forest, a UNESCO World Heritage Site and the last remaining primeval forest in the whole of Europe. International commitments are vital, but they are also fragile and vulnerable when member states fall under political or economic instability. And what's more, they're just commitments. The biggest criticism against the Paris Agreement is that there's nothing really enforceable about it. There are no severe repercussions to individual members if targets are not met. Indeed, I think this is why Nicaragua has refused to sign, one of the only countries, a country which, owing to its geographical position and infrastructure, is likely to be among the countries that are hit the worst and first by the devastating effects of global warming. Clearly, in their view, the Paris Agreement doesn't really go far enough, and it doesn't. So what's to be done? With the sheer scale of the challenge, it is hard not to feel overwhelmingly helpless. I certainly feel sad and occasionally panicky and helpless all the time about it, and then sometimes I just put it out of my mind and carry on my life and get on my Ryanair plane. But the solutions are in reach, and advances in technology and science, in particular, have made what seemed impossible even a few years ago very real and possible. Renewable energy is the most obvious example. But if we're even to have a chance of meeting targets set by the Paris Agreement, which means we have to keep global temperature rises to well below 2 degrees above pre-industrial levels, businesses, cities, investors, communities, institutions, and individuals all need to join the climate movement. And tech companies can accelerate this movement and be champions for green solutions. Why? Well, because tech companies have something that the climate movement needs. They have money, and they have a lot of people that they can reach. So for those of you who are familiar with the tech startup scene in Berlin, perhaps, you may have come across this book. Yeah, the cover speaks for itself, creative. The author, Gabriel Weinberg, is a serial entrepreneur, and he founded the search engine DuckDuckGo. It's the privacy search engine. And he basically outlines the 19 customer acquisition channels that a startup or company can explore in order to get traction. What exactly is this word traction? It's the extent to which an idea, product, etc. gains popularity or acceptance. Traction is what the climate change movement needs. Almost all of these channels are offline, you'll notice. I think apart from offline events, which in the book he said something like, if your target audience doesn't have a place to congregate online, and I think that pretty soon in a few years that there won't be many people in that category. We're living in an information age, and each one of us is a digital citizen. Our daily habits, our interactions, and our activities are all moving online. Tech companies are able to reach masses of people on an unprecedented scale. Explosive growth is not an exaggeration, and it's not uncommon. Most products or services are designed to be used every day. There are jobs and whole departments that are designed to make these apps and services as addictive and as useful as possible, for them to become daily habits. Facebook, Google, Apple, Uber, even Tinder, even our dating life is now online. Now imagine if a percentage of the profits from these companies went into tackling climate change. Imagine if corporate social responsibility was taken out of the marketing department, where it does usually sit, and embedded in the backbone of the company. If people are given a choice between a product or service that contributes to a social and environmental cause, and the same one or a similar one that doesn't, most people would choose the former, I hope. Well, this is what Ecosia tries to do and does. Ecosia's business model has one goal. It's to generate as much financial support for tree planting as possible. It's really part of the company's DNA. Like other search engine, it generates revenue from ads. The difference is that at least 80% of the profits from said revenue goes directly to financing reforestation projects. And it's working. Ecosia has planted 13 million trees to date. I think today, actually, we hit the 13 million mark. And by the end of the year, that number will have gone up to about 25 to 30 million. All paid for by the searchers, essentially. No donations. It's really simple. The more people that use Ecosia, the more trees we can plant. And why do we focus on trees? Well, there are many reasons. Protecting and restoring forests is one of the cheapest and most efficient strategies to curb not only greenhouse gas emissions, but also to advance sustainable development. The World Bank estimates that forests contributes to the livelihood of no less than 90% of people living in extreme poverty. The UN has also estimated that for every $1 spent on reforestation, $2.50 is generated in local downstream income and benefits, making tree planting one of the most economically viable ways to lift people out of poverty. Trees and growing forests provide jobs. They create dependable sources of income and healthy nutrition, which in turn helps to stabilize the local political, social, and economic situation. Trees provide a habitat for endangered species, and they can kickstart water cycles. They can restore landscapes, and they can neutralize CO2 emissions. This last point is worth emphasizing. According to the World Research Institute, the climate mitigation potential of forests is immense. I think they said that Brazil alone, through reduced deforestation in recent years, has already achieved greater emission reductions than all the Kyoto commitments combined. Yes. But if we're going to reach our goal of planting 1 billion trees in a real big goal, 1 billion trees by 2020, if we want to reach that goal, and even if we do, really it's just a drop in the ocean, peanuts. Last year, around 15 billion trees were cut down. That's a trend that's been going on for years and doesn't really seem to be slowing down. Of these 15 billion that were cut down, only a few billion were replanted, and a significant proportion of these were actually oil palms or other kind of plantation trees that don't really bring any benefit to people or to the planet. If we want to turn the tide against deforestation, and if we want to sequester carbon on a mass scale, we need to plant a lot more trees. Conservation and reforestation efforts need more financial investment. And there is certainly plenty more money where Ecosia gets it from. Last year, Google alone made $79.4 billion from ad revenue. Now, just for scale, we plant a tree at roughly 20 cents a tree. So there's a lot of potential there. Google processes around 5.5 billion searches every day. We've worked out an estimate that if only 1% of those searches were to be done through Ecosia, we would be able to finance the planting of 1.2 million trees every day. And that's just by people searching the internet. Businesses and institutions do not need regulation to make social justice and the environment their bottom line. It's a choice. Tech is one of the fastest growing and richest industries in the world. And the revenues that can be made, especially in online advertising, are staggering. If these companies were to begin measuring their success not only in profit, but in environmental and social impact, the digital revolution could really be a green one, and it can set an example for institutions and companies worldwide. The climate movement would be revolutionized. But perhaps more importantly, by reaching millions of people around the world, tech companies can create a greater environmental consciousness in people and the impact that deforestation and the several other causes of global warming are having. They can change the conversation around climate change away from this sort of bland, slightly scary, but movement that it is now. In the case of Ecosia, we focus on showing our users the positive impact that their searches have had on people's livelihoods and on nature. I certainly didn't know before I started at Ecosia that just by using a search engine, I was generating revenue for someone somewhere. Now, of course, that I know that that's there and that there's someone that wants to put that to some use, to good use, I feel really happy and I feel quite inspired because I didn't know that was even possible. So we try and show our users the positive impact that they're having. We share stories from the communities, from the people that we work with on the ground, and we share wider information about the climate movement. And we try and keep the tone positive because that's basically what we need. We need hope, and we need to inspire people that they can be part of the change as well. Slowly but surely, we are building a community. It's based on transparency, on hope, and on action. Planting a tree in people's minds can be as powerful as planting a seed on the ground. And that is something that we learnt from a woman called Sawadogo. She's a matriarch of a village in Burkina Faso, which we visited, and it was our first visit to a planting project. This was about this time last year, actually. And I think I'll just leave with her some of her words.
Est-ce que ñam nis ni ga comme ngom ne bia nguni ga ti bon la ti na fere bon ti na fere bon
to ni ndi ka makre ya ambare ton ki ko ma chele mi te ja pour la ndi ka ma kon chele ton ya makre wala windi ga ton ya adi ha ma la ya o to na na me ga song
ya song re
la ti ga yin ma ti ga yin ya pas sacre e windo.
Like Sawadogo, we can really do the same. Point out the problem, show how it's not working, and then just show the solution. It can be as simple as planting a tree, and one tree will eventually grow into a forest, and it can have a big, big impact on the rest of the world. There are lots of different solutions to climate change. It's not just one shoe fits all, and it's going to take a lot of people, a lot of work, and a lot of commitment to try and make this world an actually better place. And we hope to set an example, and that other companies and entrepreneurs will consider adopting these kind of social business models and thinking about how they can contribute, not just in their personal lives, but as a business towards making the climate revolution look more possible. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nikki. Nikki is from Ecosia, as you heard. Do we have any questions from the floor? Anybody who has a question regarding the presentation?
Could have explained that I was at Ecosia at the start, but I forgot.
I did forget that as well. So I have a question in the sense of how can you convince the big companies to do this? Because the entrepreneurs, while it's great to try and find them, to really move the dial, you're going to need a Microsoft, a Google, Facebook. Yeah,
I think, like you said, that would be amazing. I mean, a lot of our users ask us, oh, what would you do if Google started doing this? You know, take you out of business. And we'd be like, great, because that's the goal. And I think it's really hard. But again, I think Ecosia has been quite a strange development in the sort of search engine world, of which there are very few competitors. And so we're partnered with Microsoft, who we use some of their technology. And we've seen that in the reaction of the employees, they're just quite intrigued, and we've won Partner of the Year and all this kind of stuff. And I think that it can come also from the bottom of the company. Like if employees employers are realizing that their employees do care more and more about, their job and the company they work for having a good impact. But I think you're right. This is the big challenge because companies like Google and Apple are huge and have multi-stakeholder interests. So I think that is part of the challenge. I think that Google's done quite a lot of good in terms of its commitments to renewable energy. And I think that's because they've kind of led the way in showing that that's what they're doing, and that's got a lot of press and a lot of positivity. Other tech companies are sort of seeing that. I think, for example, Microsoft, who have lesser commitments and now sort of a bit like, oh, we need to catch up. So there's this sort of, I think there's a bit of a momentum thing. You know, I think if one company does something that's quite good, others will kind of follow and show, and if they're supported by the media and by people and their users. But again, it's that's kind of one of the questions, challenges.
Any questions from the floor? We have one gentleman here. Jan?
Trees and climate change, unfortunately. So my question always was, if we are having a lot of like CO2 emissions, for example, in Europe, America, China, how does planting trees in Africa help that emissions? So it's not bound locally, or?
Good question. So where we plant trees is basically we focus on areas that are the biodiversity hotspots. There's about, I think there's about 35 of them on the planet. Maybe like the most famous one is Madagascar. So they're areas that have a really, really high concentration of unique species. And it's these areas that are, they're generally in the tropics, and these are these rainforests that are there, for example, that in Madagascar and Indonesia, they're sort of commonly spoken about like the lungs of the earth. They're really important, particularly for sort of regulating really the climate and entire like systems. So planting a tree in one of these biodiversity hotspots has a higher impact than planting a tree, say, somewhere like the middle of Canada. So there is a difference where you plant trees, like it can be more impactful. And because we're sort of, you know, we, for example, a lot of our users are in the UK and in America, but we don't plant trees there because even though that might help us get some more users because people maybe think it's closer to home, but a tree planted there, especially where that can be financed by the government, whereas in Burkina Faso, they don't really have the infrastructure basically to do such large-scale work themselves. That's why you need basically NGOs. That's why they operate there. So that's where we're focusing now, because the impact is just higher, and that's kind of where it's needed most.
Any other questions from the floor? Here you go. You can just introduce yourself.
Yeah, I'm Sam Tulland. I was reluctant to ask this question because I appreciate that what you guys are doing is a very positive thing and it's something very constructive. But I've been talking to a lot of people around this kind of this issue of like, okay, what do we do, and you know, what do we have to do as a society and a culture to avert the kind of worst elements of climate change? And some people would think that by concentrating on this type of activity, where you're kind of offering, you know, say Europeans, Westerners, this chance to feel like they're doing something about, you know, the climate crisis, which at the end of the day isn't actually tackling the source, which is that we live a lifestyle here, which is unsustainable. And that unfortunately, if the rest of the world were to adopt our lifestyle, you know, we literally cannot get to a sustainable future to do so. So what do you think about that criticism of what you guys are doing, and just like, how do you move things on from where you are to where we need to go in terms of the conversation? How does this project lead to having that deeper conversation, if you know what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's a really good question. I mean, you're completely right. I mean, that's ultimately what we want. And I think to have such a sort of change in, for example, like the way that our economics runs and kind of the way we're living our lives, and, you know, essentially having some kind of carbon tax, having, you know, mandatory goals that countries need to hit with global emissions in the Paris Agreement, that would be ideal, but it's not happened and it's not happening. So what can we do now? And I think Christian, who's the founder of Ecosia, it was 9 years ago, he realized that tree planting was a really effective and quick and cheap way to sort of do large-scale work quickly. That not only is, you know, helping the environment, but also at the same time helping people, and you kind of need to have both at the same time. And he realized that, hey, look, there's this stream of revenue that's here. It's just sitting here. There's about 3 companies that are just splitting it between them. I'm just going to sort of funnel that there. And that's just what he does. So I think that you're right. There is this kind of criticism of like clicktivism, you know, I've just used it and that's fine. But I think that from speaking to users, and like sort of my job, a lot of it is just sort of speaking to our users and trying to work out, you know, how they view Goes, how they use it and why. And it's quite interesting that a lot of people who have previously never really even considered, you know, that they didn't even realize about like palm oil, for example. Like one of our projects is trying to give alternatives to palm oil. And the project itself is really small. And, you know, in the grand scheme of things, is quite insignificant. But I think that, you know, for example, in the palm oil example, that's a huge problem on a global scale. And to change that, you're going to need law, you're going to need regulation, and you're going to really need to change, you know, we have to stop consuming the palm oil, but we have to also provide an alternative, because the reason that there's like slash and burn practices, and why in Indonesia, at least, where we were when we visited the project, people are selling their land on because they have to. There's poverty. Like they need to send their children to school and they need to pay medical bills. Big palm oil plantation comes, I'll buy your land, that's it. And they don't have a sustainable future from that because, you know, in a couple of years, there's nothing left there. Whereas there are ways to make the forest itself productive. And if you can sort of empower these communities, then suddenly they won't sell their land to the palm oil companies. And that's just one aspect. You need to have, of course, you need to have at the same time, you need to have lobbying, you need to have activism. You know, the work of Greenpeace, for example, is like hugely important, I think. And I think that it's just one piece, what we're doing, but we're maybe reaching people who wouldn't have otherwise interacted with Greenpeace, for example, or who wouldn't have, you know, interacted with the green movement generally. But I think, I mean, I take the danger of the kind of sitting back and feeling, oh, I'm doing something good, but I think increasingly that probably won't be possible with, you know, just look at what's happening in America now. I think people are really starting to get a bit, oh, it's hitting closer to home.
There's also, just to approach that question as well, is from my simple point of view would be stop putting it in and start taking it out. If this carbon is causing the greenhouse effect, then there has to be a dual approach, which is let's stop putting it into our oxygen and start trying to sequester it into long-term storage, which trees do quite a good job of. But it's only half the solution. There has to be a governmental support for wind farms, for solar, for technologies that will be the oil of the 21st and 22nd centuries. And we as a country, Ireland, should be at the forefront of that. We're quite small. We can distribute it quite quickly relative to some of the other big companies. We have good tech understanding. We are a first world country with the resources to do that. And even today, just today, the government announced wind farm investment off the west coast, which should be able to power the entire planet from that. But it will have to be a multi-strand approach, because this problem hasn't gone away in the 10 years or 15 years that we've known about it, which means that it is not a simple problem. It's going to require quite a number of different solutions, all of which pulling together, and then maybe we get away with this. So that would be my view on your one strand of a whole thread of a rope that will have to be pulled on.